Right on schedule over here. Okay, now we have a policy bigwig. I'm just joking, Nick. Our next speaker is Nick Lapis, who will be presenting on SB244, Right to Repair Update. Nick is CAW's Director of Advocacy and has been with the organization since 2007. In that time, Nick has led CAW's team of advocates in campaigns to pass groundbreaking laws that have positioned California as a global leader in reducing and recovering waste. By building strong coalitions, he has helped enact policies to reduce the impacts of climate change, recover organic waste, reduce plastic pollution, and develop sustainable markets for recycled materials. Nick also engages in policy development and research, representing CAW in a variety of boards, commissions, task forces, and coalitions. Nick has led CAW's efforts to establish a right to repair in California, co-sponsoring 4 bills over 5 years, culminating in the passage of Senator Susan Eggman's SB244 in 2023. Welcome, Nick.
Good morning. It's great to be here for a couple different reasons. My first day at CAW 18 years ago was at Recycling Update, so this conference has always had a special place in my heart. And I've spoken a few times before, but I'm always in the afternoon when everybody's exhausted and has a headache. And so I'm glad to be here before everybody has a pounding headache. So I'm going to talk about the right to repair in California's SB244, which passed this year. First, just a quick word on CAW. We're an environmental organization based in Sacramento, been around since the late 70s. I see a couple board members in the room. I see Leslie and Ruth. I'm sure we have others as well that I can't see, but all folks you all know. And we have some staff in the room too. So again, it's kind of exciting to be here to talk about a finished campaign, a victory. Usually when we're working on anything, it's like one step out of 500 more steps you have to do. But in this case, we get to sort of celebrate our accomplishment. And the big accomplishment was the passage of SB244 this year. SB244 is California's right to repair law. And if you don't know what right to repair is, it sounds like this grandiose concept. It sounds like we're writing the Declaration of Independence. It's not. It's actually fairly simple. It basically says that manufacturers have to provide parts, diagnostic materials, and tools to the public and to third-party repair shops at the exact same cost that they charge their own authorized repair. And so instead of having to take your phone to thank you. Instead of having to take your phone to the Genius Bar at Apple, you can take it to the kiosk at the mall that can also change your broken screen. So one thing that's kind of interesting about the story of this whole process is how it felt like it took forever, and it was a kind of a painful process, but it really wasn't that long. So we first introduced this legislation in 2018. That was our press conference the first year we introduced it, with, interestingly enough, all different staff from the sponsoring organizations. But generally speaking, the message hasn't changed all that much. In the first 2 years that we worked on this bill, we could not get a hearing in the state assembly. We literally could not get a hearing scheduled, which I've not seen on any other bill ever. And I'm used to seeing my slides, so it's kind of weird not having them in front of me somewhere. And we basically got our butts kicked. We got like I said, we got our butts kicked by the tech industry, by some of the big tech companies like Apple. And they were able to do that without really facing too much public backlash because there was never a hearing where they showed up and opposed. And so the bills would always just die without a hearing, and some obscure tech journal would write an article about how horrible Apple is, but it never really got beyond that. When Senator Eggman, at the time she was an assembly member, when she went over to the Senate and she reintroduced the legislation, we were able to actually get our first hearing, and that was a couple years ago. And when we were able to get our first hearing, The truth is that nobody publicly wanted to oppose the bill. The bill is incredibly popular, and if you look at the actual support and opposition on the analysis, you'll see there's not a single tech company that actually opposed the bill under their own name. Every single company that opposed was part of a trade association. And if you heard the claims from the trade associations, you would think this is the worst idea that's ever happened in the history of time. Everything from their overseas hackers are going to break into your car and crash it, to intellectual property will be gone altogether. And so I kind of want to talk about how we changed the landscape from that point to the bill actually passing. There are a few really big things that happened. The first is other states acted first. New York notably passed the first right to repair law in the country. It was a very weak law. They have this weird process in New York where the governor can change the bill after it's passed, which makes no sense to me at all. But basically the legislature passed a good bill, and then the industry was able to weaken most of it through the process. And the version that was signed was incredibly weak. But it sort of opened the floodgates to legislatures are seriously considering this concept. And then Minnesota passed actually a decent right to repair law. And so again, we're kind of building on other states. It also helped that this issue really got to a lot more prominence because the president tweeted about it. Our attorney general submitted comments in support of right to repair. It became a more high-profile issue on the national stage. There was also a big push in the press. Our bill for basically it's where it got stuck in the process was in the Senate Appropriations Committee. And for anybody who doesn't know, the way that appropriations committees work in the legislature is that everything goes in there and then they announce what bills get released. And so they don't have a hearing, it's not a public process, it's kind of a backdoor decision. And that makes it a really good place to kill things that are popular, but that they don't actually want to pass. And thankfully, the press did a pretty good job about calling out the chair of that committee. And specifically, he was running for Congress. The LA Times explicitly called him out and said, Senator Portantino, this is on you. You can't let this proposal keep dying. And that was a big breaking point for us. There were so many different factors together, it's a little hard to tell what exactly was the driving force. But another main force is an issue you all are very aware of, which is the lithium-ion battery fires we've been having in California. Notably, the fire across the bay at South Bayside, where their entire MRF burned down, and I think that sort of drove home the impacts of needing to repair products instead of having to throw them away. The Federal Trade Commission also released a report basically debunking the claims of the industry. And that was a breakthrough because it's one thing for an environmental organization to say, no, this bill has nothing to do with your car getting hacked and driven off the cliff or something, because we're not credible messengers. But when the Federal Trade Commission comes out and says, actually, this is anti-competitive, here's why all the alarmist arguments don't make sense, it carries a lot more weight. We did our fair share of lobby days and rallies and repair cafes spanning the entire 5-year process. Starting with, in the top left corner was a repair cafe in 2018 when we were first introducing the bill on the grounds of the Capitol, to some of the other ones here were repair cafes and fix-it clinics in the legislator's district who was holding up the bill. Lobby days, both in person and via Zoom, and more rallies than I can count. Something else that we did was we really tried to make it obvious to the public where legislators were on these bills. And so this was us standing between the legislative office building and the Capitol as legislators walk from their office to the Capitol. And we asked them to stop and pose for a photo. And then we tagged them on Twitter. you know, whatever works, right? And the big takeaway that a lot of people had from this bill was, well, Apple came on board and that's why the bill passed. And that's sort of true. But really, it was everything else that led up to Apple feeling like they had to negotiate. And up until this past year, we could not get a single tech company to meet with us. The lobbyists would meet with us sometimes, and they would say something to the effect of, I'm sorry, my client hasn't authorized me to negotiate on this. We heard that over and over and over. Apple never actually submitted an opposed position on the bill. But the tech, they hid behind the trade associations, and the trade associations were told they were not allowed to negotiate. With all the pressure, Senator Portantino basically went to Apple and said, look, I'm going to let this bill out. If you want to start negotiating a deal, you should. And they reached out. They gave us a list of 8 things they wanted. We agreed to split the baby on half. We said no to half. Nothing was that major. And that really changed the dynamic in the legislature because it brought on Apple in support. And once Apple was in support, there actually wasn't a single legislator who wanted to vote no on the bill. And so it was interesting, actually, after years. It was interesting after years of going back and forth, when we finally got Apple on board, and then we swept the Senate on a unanimous vote. I had all these lobbyists reach out and say, "Oh, my client is so mad at Apple because they struck a side deal." I won't name the tech companies, but major tech companies. Yeah, I don't want to. This goes up on YouTube afterwards, so yeah. But major tech companies saying, "Oh, Apple always wants the attention." But they didn't want to engage with us either for years leading up to this process. So what's next? I realize I'm running out of time. What's next? I think there's a few things that are coming up. One is I would love for other states to leapfrog us. That happened with Oregon last week. They passed a bill. I don't believe it's been signed yet, but they passed a right to repair bill that actually goes beyond California's. It includes an issue we weren't able to address called parts pairing. So all 4 other states leapfrogging us. I mean, that'd be the best outcome. The second thing that I think is next for the right to repair issue is the Federal Trade Commission really taking action and making this federal. Because fundamentally, this is an anti-competitive practice to not allow folks to have their products repaired. And the FTC has an opportunity to kind of go around the 50 states passing legislation and just act unilaterally. And I'll leave it at that. There's my contact information. I can answer any questions. I gotta say, this is the first time that I don't get a bunch of angry questions because I'm not talking about something that pisses off half the audience. So.
I'm not angry. I just wanted you to say what happens next. When does it go into effect, and where will we see this in our communities?
Yeah, thank you. So the law goes into effect July, and it's actually retroactive 3 years, depending on the device type. But basically, starting July, manufacturers will have to provide those parts and tools. In terms of how it's enforced, there's no state agency that's charged with enforcement, but the Attorney General and the district attorneys are given authority to enforce. And the way it's worked in some other states is that the Attorney Generals have kind of come out with guidance, basically laying out what they expect to see out of the manufacturers.
David, are there any questions online?
Why, yes. This is from Lori. Do you know if consumers have to pay for their manuals?
So again, the requirement is that they have to provide it on the same terms they provide to their authorized repair. And so if it's free to their authorized repair, then it has to be free to consumers. If they charge their authorized repair, then they can charge consumers, but they can't charge them more.
Yeah, my question is, what were some of the compromises you had to make and that you would have liked to have seen in the law?
Yeah, it was a few, there was a list of issues that we wanted to see that we didn't necessarily get to in this bill. like the parts pairing issue that Oregon just handled. And that's the idea that, Apple, I think, is the only company that does this, but they tie your screen to your individual device. So if you take two identical iPhones and you swap screens, it won't work. It's like an organ getting rejected. Like, it's crazy. We weren't able to address that, and it wasn't ever in the bill, but it's something we would have liked to have done. Other stuff was really just about, kind of basic negotiating. Like, we wanted 7 years of retroactivity. The tech companies wanted none, and so we settled on 3. A lot of stuff like that where it's really just splitting the baby.
There was one more question here from Palo Alto. Do you have a question?
Thank you. Yes, no?